Hi guys, so welcome back to the Mental Health Diaries. Today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about happy chemicals and antidepressants. Now the reason I'm doing this video is because a few of you have asked me to talk a little bit about how antidepressants work. I'm going to be honest, I was a little bit conflicted about doing a video on this, mainly just because, one, I'm not a medical professional. All the information I am going to talk about is just stuff I've picked up on from my degree and from my own research. But also I just wanted to really emphasise the importance that we're not diagnosing anyone in this video. If you're on a course of treatment that perhaps isn't working for you, or you're perhaps considering going on to medication, go speak to your primary physician, speak to your GP or your psychiatrist. I worry because a lot of the information that's out there on antidepressants is very informative, it's very useful. The thing is, when you're getting your information from the internet, it doesn't necessarily always take into consideration the context of your situation. So sometimes when you experience things like depression and anxiety, it could be circumstantial. It could be a period of your life when you're under a particular amount of stress. But if you're experiencing things like depression and anxiety and you're unable to sort of identify what it is that's getting you down, more often than not, it's a chemical imbalance. And that's what we're going to speak about today. So when we talk about neurobiology, essentially what that is, it's the brain and the nervous system, and they generate sensation, perception, movement, learning and emotion, just basically any sort of function that makes us human. So it's all well and good trying to sort of understand why we're feeling depressed and the reasons why that is happening, but it's important to know the actual biology behind what is happening when you experience an emotion in order to know how to treat it, if that makes any sense. So where do emotions come from? The emotions that we categorise, like sadness and happiness, feeling inspired or feeling motivated, they are all chemical reactions in the brain that come from the main four neurotransmitters or hormones, and that is dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin and endorphins. So the first one we're going to talk about is dopamine, and dopamine is what is known as the pleasure and the reward chemical. So this neurotransmitter basically has a large part to play in our motivation and our work ethic. So that feeling of pride you get at the end of the day when you've ticked everything off your to-do list, or if you've had a particularly productive time, that's dopamine that you're experiencing. Now, it's essential to our survival, this chemical. So let's try and think of an example. If you look in the wild, if you look at a monkey, when they manage to find a clever way to get a banana from a tree, right? This is a very oversimplified example, but that will then release dopamine in their brain because it encourages them to find new ways and innovative ways to aid their survival. So there was a research study done actually, and it's on lab rats, and they had two groups. One of the groups was high in dopamine levels and the other one had low dopamine levels. And essentially what they did is they put piles of food, a large pile and a small pile in front of each group of rats. Now the large pile was surrounded by a fence, so it was a little bit more work to get to the large pile. Now I'm sure you can obviously imagine what happened here. The group with high dopamine levels definitely went for the larger pile. They climbed the fence, they found ways to get around the obstacles for the bigger reward. It's all about reward at the end of the day with dopamine. The group of rats with lower dopamine levels just went for the small pile. And that can be seen in all sorts of different walks of life with people with depression and low dopamine levels, finding it difficult to lack the ability to go the extra mile to get the bigger reward. We're all about immediate gratification when you're experiencing depression and anxiety a lot of the time. So yeah, that's dopamine in a sort of nutshell. Dopamine is a really great neurochemical, but it can also be dangerous if you have too much dopamine. So if you have too much dopamine, you can become quite irritable, you've got lots of excess energy, you can even sort of have tics and things like that, hyperactivity, lack of focus and attention if you have an excess of dopamine. So a lot of illegal drugs and alcohol and things like chocolate and sweets, they basically stimulate a release of dopamine in the brain, which is fun, and that's why a lot of us enjoy those things, but because it can be quite addictive, that's when it can sort of have adverse effects on us. But dopamine is something that you can easily very regulate with your diet. So if you eat foods full of protein, high in protein, like chicken, fish, eggs, nuts, beans, even cheese to an extent. That can help it with your dopamine. So the next one then, we're going to talk about is serotonin. Now, I'm just going to make a point. So a lot of the 4 chemicals I'm talking about today, when we're relating them to mental health disorders, they can be, there can be some overlap, if that makes sense. So they're tri-diagnostic. They can be seen, and that's why it's difficult sometimes when you go on a course of treatment for mental health, because sometimes it can be an excess of one thing, it can be an excess of serotonin and a lack of dopamine, but until you try different courses of treatment, it's hard to know. And if you go on to something like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is what I'm going to talk about in a moment, and you actually have an excess of serotonin, it can have the opposite effect. So it's really important, if you are taking medication, to keep a note of what's going on, how you feel, whether it be just a little journal, write down things like how it's affecting your mood, how it's affecting your sleep pattern, your appetite, your sex drive, your motivation, and then it does help practitioners identify what it is that is causing the imbalance. But moving on to serotonin. So serotonin is known as happiness chemical, and it stimulates feelings of pleasure and relaxation, and when we're winding down, that's when serotonin is kicking in. So if you're experiencing a lot of anxiety, if you're overthinking a lot, if your behaviour is quite compulsive, you might be experiencing a lack of serotonin. So weirdly, actually, 90% of your serotonin is found in the gut, in the intestine, and in your blood platelets. So it plays a really, really important role in our digestion. So in order to have a high level of, a decent level of serotonin, carbohydrates are really, really important. And this is something that a lot of people don't know when they're crash dieting. People cut out carbohydrates because they're seen as the nutrient that puts on the biggest weight, because they tend to be high in calories. But carbohydrates are really, really important in our production of serotonin in the pituitary gland in the brain. So when you have things like bread, pasta, potatoes, they can all help. The other thing that's crucial to serotonin is vitamin D. Vitamin D production stimulates the release of serotonin. So obviously that can be quite difficult when you live in England and it's the winter and the weather is awful and there's not a lot of sunlight, but you can pick up vitamin D tablets from any sort of pharmacy, really, from Boots, Superdrug, you can just pick them up. So that is useful in your serotonin. Now, when we talk about antidepressants, the most common one that everyone's heard of is serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SRIs. And things like citalopram, fluoxetine, Prozac, they're all SRIs. They work in slightly different ways. I'm not going to go into the details of that too much, but essentially what it does is, if you imagine you've got 2 neurons, I'm going to do you a little diagram. So you've got a neuron here. This is the end of a neuron. It's really badly drawn, so just bear with me. And then in the end of the neuron, you've got a little vesicle with your neurotransmitter in, your serotonin. Can you see that? So what happens is this will basically come out of the one neurotransmitter and this neurochemical is released. These are the little dots. And then on the other side, you've got your other neuron. And these will bind onto little receptors which pass the dopamine or the serotonin or whatever it is around your nervous system. Now what can happen is, if you have a lack of serotonin, is all these little chemicals in the middle that aren't getting taken up by the receptors on the second neuron will get repackaged and sent back up into the first neuron to basically go again, to try it again. Now what these SRIs do when you take antidepressants is they inhibit the reuptake of those chemicals, and they force it to be binded on the receptors on the other one and forces it to go through, which increases the production, not the production, but the transmission of the neurochemical. So that's basically how antidepressants work. But again, it's really important to realise that it might not necessarily be serotonin. That's the first one that practitioners tend to put you on when you first go and say you're experiencing problems with low mood and sleep and lack of appetite and things like that. but only 40% of people that take SRIs actually benefit from them. So it is really important to keep an eye on how they're affecting you if you're on a course of treatment or you're considering going on a course of treatment. So the third one that we're going to talk about is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is known as the love hormone, and it gets produced when we are in close proximity or physical contact with loved ones, whether that be a friend, a family member or a lover. And it does play a large role in our self-esteem as well. So if you're someone that regularly feels lonely, not enjoys their own company but tends to feel quite reclusive, finds it difficult to have social interactions, or you're quite protective of your own company, it might be that you're lacking in oxytocin. Now, it is called the love hormone. It's not necessarily always just something that we get from physical relationships and regular sexual activity, but this is something that can help. That's why we enjoy being in relationships, because when you apply pressure to your nervous system, it basically releases oxytocin. So oxytocin is something that can have benefits for our sex drive, our self-esteem, our anxiety. It can make us feel happier when we're engaging in social interactions, and it is important for survival, because social networking helps us with survival. You know, if you get on with people and you have a healthy social network, then it also means that you're going to more than likely have a healthy support network. So oxytocin is another one to consider. Oxytocin can be released as well from having things like massages. So if you have regular massages or hot showers, things like that, anything that stimulates your body can help with oxytocin. And then that leaves the final one, which is endorphins. Endorphins are crucial to pain relief. So more often than not, when you're exercising, for example, you will release endorphins because you will feel a sense of euphoria, which basically stops you from feeling pain. So again, when you're having sex or you're exercising, any sort of physical activity, this helps you produce endorphins, and it stops you from feeling achy and painy. Painy, that's not a word, but you know what I mean. Again, it's crucial to things like sleeping, appetite, and just our general well-being, really. So that's kind of a brief summary of the big four neurochemicals that are called the happy chemicals. But there is lots of resources online that go into a little bit more information about how they all work. I would encourage people to sort of look those up if you feel like some of the information I've given you relates, if you're experiencing some of the symptoms that you get from a deficit or an imbalance of each of those four. There's loads of ways that you can help yourself increase those without going on medication. Again, I'm not saying that I'm recommending any sort of course of treatment. Speak to your GP if you have any concerns, but there is loads and loads of information out there. So hopefully that's given you a little bit more of a background about how neurobiology affects our emotions, and the more we learn about the chemicals and the reactions that go on in our body, the more we can relate it to our behaviour and what behaviours we're engaging in and how that's going to impact our depression and anxiety. So I hope that helps a little bit. I know I've waffled on a bit there. But yeah, if you've got any further questions or you want me to share some links or resources to where I found a lot of this information, just give me a shout. But other than that, have a lovely weekend.